Chapter 16 of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
June 1st, 1821. We have just returned to Stanningley. That is, we returned some days ago, and I am not yet settled, and feel as if I never should be. We left town sooner than was intended, in consequence of my uncle's indisposition. I wonder what would have been the result if we had stayed the full time. I am quite ashamed of my new-sprung distaste for country life. All my former occupations seem so tedious and dull, my former amusements so insipid and unprofitable. I cannot enjoy my music, because there is no one to hear it. I cannot enjoy my walks, because there is no one to meet. I cannot enjoy my books, because they have not power to arrest my attention. My head is so haunted with the recollections of the last few weeks that I cannot attend to them. My drawing suits me best, for I can draw and think at the same time, and if my productions cannot now be seen by any one but myself, and those who do not care about them, they possibly may be hereafter. But then, there is one face I am always trying to paint or to sketch, and always without success, and that vexes me. As for the owner of that face, I cannot get him out of my mind, and indeed I never try. I wonder whether he ever thinks of me, and I wonder whether I shall ever see him again. And then might follow a train of other wonderments, questions for time and fate to answer, concluding with, supposing all the rest be answered in the affirmative, I wonder whether I shall ever repent it, as my aunt would tell me I should, if she knew what I was thinking about. How distinctly I remember our conversation that evening before our departure for town, when we were sitting together over the fire, my uncle having gone to bed with a slight attack of the gout.
"Helen,"
said she, after a thoughtful silence,
"do you ever think about marriage?
Yes, aunt, often.
And do you ever contemplate the possibility of being married yourself, or engaged, before the season is over?"
Sometimes, but I don't think it at all likely that I ever shall.
Why so?
Because, I imagine, there must be only a very, very few men in the world that I should like to marry, and of those few, it is 10 to 1 I may never be acquainted with one, or if I should, it is 20 to 1 he may not happen to be single, or to take a fancy to me.
That is no argument at all. It may be very true, and I hope is true, that there are very few men whom you would choose to marry of yourself. It is not, indeed, to be supposed that you would wish to marry any one till you were asked. A girl's affections should never be won unsought. But when they are sought, when the citadel of the heart is fairly besieged, it is apt to surrender sooner than the owner is aware of, and often against her better judgment, and in opposition to all her preconceived ideas of what she could have loved, unless she be extremely careful and discreet. Now, I want to warn you, Helen, of these things, and to exhort you to be watchful and circumspect from the very commencement of your career, and not to suffer your heart to be stolen from you by the first foolish or unprincipled person that covets the possession of it. You know, my dear, you are only just 18. There's plenty of time before you, and neither your uncle nor I are in any hurry to get you off our hands, and I may venture to say there will be no lack of suitors, for you can boast a good family, a pretty considerable fortune and expectations, and I may as well tell you likewise, for if I don't, others will, that you have a fair share of beauty besides, and I hope you may never have cause to regret it."
"I hope not, aunt. But why should you fear it?"
"Because, my dear, beauty is that quality which, next to money, is generally the most attractive to the worst kinds of men, and therefore it is likely to entail a great deal of trouble on the possessor."
"Have you been troubled in that way, aunt?"
"No, Helen,"
said she, with reproachful gravity.
"but I know many that have, and some, through carelessness, have been the wretched victims of deceit, and some, through weakness, have fallen into snares and temptations terrible to relate."
"Well, I shall be neither careless nor weak."
"Remember Peter, Helen. Don't boast, but watch. Keep a guard over your eyes and ears as the inlets of your heart, and over your lips as the outlet, lest they betray you in a moment of unwariness. Receive, coldly and dispassionately, every attention, till you have ascertained and duly considered the worth of the aspirant, and let your affections be consequent upon approbation alone. First study, then approve, then love. Let your eyes be blind to all external attractions, your ears deaf to all the fascinations of flattery and light discourse. These are nothing, and worse than nothing, snares and wiles of the tempter to lure the thoughtless to their own destruction. Principle is the first thing, after all, and next to that, good sense, respectability, and moderate wealth. If you should marry the handsomest and most accomplished and superficially agreeable man in the world, you little know the misery that would overwhelm you if, after all, you should find him to be a worthless reprobate, or even an impracticable fool.
But what are all the poor fools and reprobates to do, aunt? If everybody followed your advice, the world would soon come to an end.
Never fear, my dear. The male fools and reprobates will never want for partners, while there are so many of the other sex to match them. But do you follow my advice. And this is no subject for jesting, Helen. I am sorry to see you treat the matter in that light way. Believe me, matrimony is a serious thing.
And she spoke it so seriously that one might have fancied she had known it to her cost. But I asked no more impertinent questions, and merely answered, "I know it is, and I know there is truth and sense in what you say. But you need not fear me, for I not only should think it wrong to marry a man that was deficient in sense or in principle, but I should never be tempted to do it, for I could not like him, if he were ever so handsome and ever so charming in other respects. I should hate him, despise him, pity him, anything but love him. My affections not only ought to be founded on approbation, but they will and must be so, for without approving I cannot love. It is needless to say I ought to be able to respect and honour the man I marry, as well as love him, for I cannot love him without. So set your mind at rest."
I hope it may be so,
answered she. "I know it is so," persisted I.
You have not been tried yet, Helen. We can but hope,
said she, in her cold, cautious way. I was vexed at her incredulity, but I am not sure her doubts were entirely without sagacity. I fear I have found it much easier to remember her advice than to profit by it. Indeed, I have sometimes been led to question the soundness of her doctrines on those subjects. Her counsels may be good, as far as they go, in the main points at least, but there are some things she has overlooked in her calculations. I wonder if she was ever in love. I commenced my career, or my first campaign, as my uncle calls it, kindling with bright hopes and fancies, chiefly raised by this conversation, and full of confidence in my own discretion. At first I was delighted with the novelty and excitement of our London life, but soon I began to weary of its mingled turbulence and constraint, and sigh for the freshness and freedom of home. My new acquaintances, both male and female, disappointed my expectations, and vexed and depressed me by turns, for I soon grew tired of studying their peculiarities, and laughing at their foibles, particularly as I was obliged to keep my criticisms to myself, for my aunt would not hear them, and they, the ladies especially, appeared so provokingly mindless, and heartless, and artificial. The gentlemen seemed better, but perhaps it was because I knew them less, perhaps because they flattered me, but I did not fall in love with any of them, and if their attentions pleased me one moment, they provoked me the next, because they put me out of humour with myself, by revealing my vanity and making me fear I was becoming like some of the ladies I so heartily despised. There was one elderly gentleman that annoyed me very much, a rich old friend of my uncle's, who, I believe, thought I could not do better than marry him. But, besides being old, he was ugly and disagreeable, and wicked, I am sure, though my aunt scolded me for saying so, but she allowed he was no saint. And there was another, less hateful, but still more tiresome, because she favoured him, and was always thrusting him upon me, and sounding his praises in my ears, Mr. Boreham by name, Boreham, as I prefer spelling it, for a terrible bore he was. I shudder still at the remembrance of his voice, drone, 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 in my ear, while he sat beside me, prosing away by the half hour together, and beguiling himself with the notion that he was improving my mind by useful information, or impressing his dogmas upon me, and reforming my errors of judgment, or perhaps that he was talking down to my level, and amusing me with entertaining discourse. Yet he was a decent man enough in the main, I dare say, and if he had kept his distance, I never would have hated him. As it was almost impossible to help it, for he not only bothered me with the infliction of his own presence, but he kept me from the enjoyment of more agreeable society. One night, however, at a ball, he had been more than usually tormenting, and my patience was quite exhausted. It appeared as if the whole evening was fated to be insupportable. I had just had one dance with an empty-headed coxcomb, and then Mr. Boreham had come upon me, and seemed determined to cling to me for the rest of the night. He never danced himself, and there he sat, poking his head in my face, and impressing all beholders with the idea that he was a confirmed, acknowledged lover, my aunt looking complacently on all the time, and wishing him God-speed. In vain I attempted to drive him away by giving a loose to my exasperated feelings, even to positive rudeness. Nothing could convince him that his presence was disagreeable. Sullen silence was taken for rapt attention, and gave him greater room to talk. Sharp answers were received as smart sallies of girlish vivacity that only required an indulgent rebuke, and flat contradictions were but as oil to the flames, calling forth new strains of argument to support his dogmas, and bringing down upon me endless floods of reasoning to overwhelm me with conviction. But there was one present who seemed to have a better appreciation of my frame of mind. A gentleman stood by, who had been watching our conference for some time, evidently much amused at my companion's remorseless pertinacity and my manifest annoyance, and laughing to himself at the asperity and uncompromising spirit of my replies. At length, however, he withdrew, and went to the lady of the house, apparently for the purpose of asking an introduction to me, for shortly after they both came up, and she introduced him as Mr. Huntingdon, the son of a late friend of my uncle's. He asked me to dance. I gladly consented, of course, and he was my companion during the remainder of my stay, which was not long, for my aunt, as usual, insisted upon an early departure. I was sorry to go, for I had found my new acquaintance a very lively and entertaining companion. There was a certain graceful ease and freedom about all he said and did, that gave a sense of repose and expansion to the mind, after so much constraint and formality as I had been doomed to suffer. There might be, it is true, a little too much careless boldness in his manner and address, but I was in so good a humour, and so grateful for my late deliverance from Mr. Boreham, that it did not anger me.
"Well, Helen, how do you like Mr. Boreham now?"
said my aunt, as we took our seats in the carriage and drove away. "Worse than ever," I replied. She looked displeased, but said no more on that subject.
"Who was the gentleman you danced with last?"
resumed she, after a pause.
"That was so officious in helping you on with your shawl."
"He was not officious at all, aunt. He never attempted to help me till he saw Mr. Boreham coming to do so, and then he stepped laughingly forward and said, 'Come, I'll preserve you from that affliction.'"
"Who was it, I ask?"
said she, with frigid gravity. "It was Mr. Huntingdon, the son of uncle's old friend."
"I have heard your uncle speak of young Mr. Huntingdon. I have heard him say, 'He's a fine lad, that young Huntingdon, but a bit wildish, I fancy.' So I'd have you beware."
"What does a bit wildish mean?" I inquired.
"It means destitute of principle, and prone to every vice that is common to youth."
"But I've heard uncle say he was a sad wild fellow himself when he was young." She sternly shook her head. "He was jesting then, I suppose," said I, "and here he was speaking at random. At least, I cannot believe there is any harm in those laughing blue eyes."
"False reasoning, Helen,"
said she, with a sigh. "Well, we ought to be charitable, you know, aunt. Besides, I don't think it is false. I am an excellent physiognomist, and I always judge of people's characters by their looks, not by whether they are handsome or ugly, but by the general cast of the countenance. For instance, I should know by your countenance that you were not of a cheerful sanguine disposition, and I should know by Mr. Wilmot's that he was a worthless old reprobate, and by Mr. Boreham's that he was not an agreeable companion, and by Mr. Huntingdon's that he was neither a fool nor a knave, though possibly neither a sage nor a saint, but that is no matter to me, as I'm not likely to meet him again, unless as an occasional partner in the ball-room. It was not so, however, for I met him again next morning. He came to call upon my uncle, apologizing for not having done so before, by saying he was only lately returned from the Continent, and had not heard, till the previous night, of my uncle's arrival in town, and after that I often met him, sometimes in public, sometimes at home, for he was very assiduous in paying his respects to his old friend, who did not, however, consider himself greatly obliged by the attention.
"I wonder what the deuce the lad means by coming so often,"
he would say.
"Can you tell, Helen? Hey? He wants none of my company, nor I his, that's certain."
"I'd wish you'd tell him so, then,"
said my aunt.
"Why? What for? If I don't want him, somebody does, mayhap."
Winking at me.
"Besides, he's a pretty tidy fortune, Peggy, you know, not such a catch as Wilmot, but then Helen won't hear of that match, for somehow these old chaps don't go down with the girls, with all their money and their experience to boot. I'll bet anything she'd rather have this young fellow without a penny than Wilmot with his house full of gold, wouldn't you, Nell?"
"Yes, uncle, but that's not saying much for Mr. Huntingdon, for I'd rather be an old maid and a pauper than Mrs. Wilmot."
"And Mrs. Huntingdon? What would you rather be than Mrs. Huntingdon, eh?"
"I'll tell you when I've considered the matter."
"Ah, it needs consideration, then. But come now, would you rather be an old maid, let alone the pauper?"
"I can't tell till I'm asked." And I left the room immediately, to escape further examination. But 5 minutes after, in looking from my window, I beheld Mr. Boreham coming up to the door. I waited nearly half an hour in uncomfortable suspense, expecting every minute to be called, and vainly longing to hear him go. Then footsteps were heard on the stairs, and my aunt entered the room with a solemn countenance, and closed the door behind her.
"Here's Mr. Boreham, Helen,"
said she.
"He wishes to see you."
"Oh, aunt, can't you tell him I'm indisposed? I'm sure I am, to see him."
"Nonsense, my dear, this is no trifling matter. He is come on a very important errand, to ask your hand in marriage of your uncle and me."
"I hope my uncle and you told him it was not in your power to give it. What right had he to ask anyone before me?"
"Helen!"
"What did my uncle say?"
"He said he would not interfere in the matter. If you liked to accept Mr. Boreham's obliging offer, you—"
"Did he say obliging offer?"
"No. He said if you liked to take him you might, and if not, you might please yourself."
"He said right. And what did you say?"
"It is no matter what I said. What will you say? That is the question. He is now waiting to ask you himself, but consider well before you go, and if you intend to refuse him, give me your reasons."
"I shall refuse him, of course, but you must tell me how, for I want to be civil, and yet decided, and when I've got rid of him, I'll give you my reasons afterwards."
"But stay, Helen, sit down a little and compose yourself. Mr. Boreham is in no particular hurry, for he has little doubt of your acceptance, and I want to speak with you. Tell me, my dear, what are your objections to him? Do you deny that he is an upright, honourable man?"
"No."
"Do you deny that he is sensible, sober, respectable?"
"No. He may be all this, but—"
"But, Helen, how many such men do you expect to meet with in the world? Upright, honourable, sensible, sober, respectable. Is this such an everyday character that you should reject the possessor of such noble qualities without a moment's hesitation? Yes, noble I may call them, for think of the full meaning of each and how many inestimable virtues they include, and I might add many more to the list, and consider that all this is laid at your feet. It is in your power to secure this inestimable blessing for life, a worthy and excellent husband who loves you tenderly, but not too fondly, so as to blind him to your faults, and will be your guide throughout life's pilgrimage and your partner in eternal bliss. Think how—
"But I hate him, aunt," said I, interrupting this unusual flow of eloquence.
Hate him? Helen, is this a Christian spirit? You hate him? And he's so good a man.
"I don't hate him as a man, but as a husband. As a man, I love him so much that I wish him a better wife than I, one as good as himself, or better, if you think that possible, provided she could like him. But I never could, and therefore—"
But why not? What objection do you find?
"Firstly, he is at least 40 years old, considerably more, I should think, and I am but 18. Secondly, he is narrow-minded and bigoted in the extreme. Thirdly, his tastes and feelings are wholly dissimilar to mine. Fourthly, his looks, voice, and manner are particularly displeasing to me. And finally, I have an aversion to his whole person that I never can surmount."
Then you ought to surmount it. And please to compare him for a moment with Mr. Huntingdon, and, good looks apart, which contribute nothing to the merit of the man or to the happiness of married life, and which you have so often professed to hold in light esteem, tell me which is the better man.
"I have no doubt Mr. Huntingdon is a much better man than you think him, but we are not talking about him now, but about Mr. Boreham; and as I would rather grow, live, and die in single blessedness than be his wife, it is but right that I should tell him so at once, and put him out of suspense. So let me go."
But don't give him a flat denial. He has no idea of such a thing, and it would offend him greatly. Say you have no thoughts of matrimony at present.
"But I have thoughts of it."
Or that you desire a further acquaintance.
"But I don't desire a further acquaintance. Quite the contrary." And without waiting for further admonitions, I left the room, and went to seek Mr. Boreham. He was walking up and down the drawing-room, humming snatches of tunes, and nibbling the end of his cane.
"My dear young lady,"
said he, bowing and smirking with great complacency,
"I have your kind guardian's permission."
"I know, sir," said I, wishing to shorten the scene as much as possible, "and I am greatly obliged for your preference, but must beg to decline the honour you wish to confer, for I think we were not made for each other, as you yourself would shortly discover if the experiment were tried." My aunt was right. It was quite evident he had had little doubt of my acceptance, and no idea of a positive denial. He was amazed, astounded at such an answer, but too incredulous to be much offended, and after a little humming and hawing, he returned to the attack.
"I know, my dear, that there exists a considerable disparity between us in years, in temperament, and perhaps some other things. But let me assure you, I shall not be severe to mark the faults and foibles of a young and ardent nature such as yours; and while I acknowledge them to myself, and even rebuke them with all a father's care, believe me, no youthful lover could be more tenderly indulgent towards the object of his affections than I to you. And, on the other hand, let me hope that my more experienced years and graver habits of reflection will be no disparagement in your eyes, as I shall endeavour to make them more conducive to your happiness. Come now, what do you say? Let us have no young ladies' affectations and caprices, but speak out at once."
"I will, but only to repeat what I said before, that I am certain we were not made for each other."
"You really think so?"
"I do."
"But you don't know me. You wish for a further acquaintance, a longer time to—"
"No, I don't. I know you as well as I ever shall, and better than you know me, or you would never dream of uniting yourself to one so incongruous, so utterly unsuitable to you in every way."
"But, my dear young lady, I don't look for perfection. I can excuse—"
"Thank you, Mr. Boreham, but I won't trespass upon your goodness. You may save your indulgence and consideration for some more worthy object, that won't tax them so heavily."
"But let me beg you to consult your aunt. That excellent lady, I'm sure, will—"
"I have consulted her, and I know her wishes coincide with yours, but in such important matters I take the liberty of judging for myself, and no persuasion can alter my inclinations, or induce me to believe that such a step would be conducive to my happiness or yours. And I wonder that a man of your experience and discretion should think of choosing such a wife.
"Ah, well,"
said he,
"I have sometimes wondered at that myself. I have sometimes said to myself, 'Now, Boreham, what is this you're after? Take care, man, look before you leap. This is a sweet, bewitching creature, but remember, the brightest attractions to the lover too often prove the husband's greatest torments.' I assure you my choice has not been made without much reasoning and reflection. The seeming imprudence of the match has cost me many an anxious thought by day and many a sleepless hour by night. But at length I satisfied myself that it was not, in very deed, imprudent. I saw my sweet girl was not without her faults, but of these her youth, I trusted, was not one, but rather an earnest of virtues yet unblown, a strong ground of presumption that her little defects of temper and errors of judgment, opinion, or manner were not irremediable, but might easily be removed or mitigated by the patient efforts of a watchful and judicious adviser, and where I failed to enlighten and control, I thought I might safely undertake to pardon for the sake of her many excellencies. Therefore, my dearest girl, since I am satisfied, why should you object? On my account, at least."
"But to tell you the truth, Mr. Boreham, it is on my own account I principally object. So let us drop the subject, I would have said, for it is worse than useless to pursue it any further. But he pertinaciously interrupted me with,
"But why so? I would love you, cherish you, protect you,"
etc., etc. I shall not trouble myself to put down all that passed between us. Suffice it to say, that I found him very troublesome, and very hard to convince that I really meant what I said, and really was so obstinate and blind to my own interests, that there was no shadow of a chance that either he or my aunt would ever be able to overcome my objections. Indeed, I am not sure that I succeeded after all, though wearied with his so pertinaciously returning to the same point, and repeating the same arguments over and over again, forcing me to reiterate the same replies. I at length turned short and sharp upon him, and my last words were, "I tell you plainly that it cannot be. No consideration can induce me to marry against my inclinations. I respect you. At least I would respect you, if you would behave like a sensible man. But I cannot love you, and never could. And the more you talk, the further you repel me. So pray don't say any more about it." Whereupon he wished me a good morning, and withdrew, disconcerted and offended, no doubt. But surely it was not my fault.
End of chapter 16. Of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
The next day I accompanied my uncle and aunt to a dinner party at Mr. Wilmot's. He had 2 ladies staying with him, his niece, Annabella, a fine dashing girl, or rather young woman, of some 25, too great a flirt to be married, according to her own assertion, but greatly admired by the gentlemen, who universally pronounced her a splendid woman, and her gentle cousin, Millicent Hargrave, who had taken a violent fancy to me, mistaking me for something vastly better than I was. And I, in return, was very fond of her. I should entirely exclude poor Millicent in my general animadversions against the ladies of my acquaintance, but it was not on her account, or her cousin's, that I have mentioned the party. It was for the sake of another of Mr. Wilmot's guests, to wit, Mr. Huntingdon. I have good reason to remember his presence there, for this was the last time I saw him. He did not sit near me at dinner, for it was his fate to hand in a capacious old dowager, and mine to be handed in by Mr. Grimsby, a friend of his, but a man I very greatly disliked. There was a sinister cast in his countenance, and a mixture of lurking ferocity and fulsome insincerity in his demeanour, that I could not away with. What a tiresome custom that is, by the by! One among the many sources of fictitious annoyance of this ultra-civilized life. If the gentlemen must lead the ladies into the dining-room, why cannot they take those they like best? I am not sure, however, that Mr. Huntingdon would have taken me, if he had been at liberty to make his own selection. It is quite possible he might have chosen Miss Wilmot, for she seemed bent upon engrossing his attention to herself, and he seemed nothing loth to pay the homage she demanded. I thought so, at least, when I saw how they talked and laughed, and glanced across the table, to the neglect and evident umbrage of their respective neighbours; and afterwards, as the gentleman joined us in the drawing-room, when she, immediately upon his entrance, loudly called upon him to be the arbiter of a dispute between herself and another lady, and he answered the summons with alacrity, and decided the question without a moment's hesitation in her favour, though to my thinking she was obviously in the wrong, and then stood chatting familiarly with her and a group of other ladies, while I sat with Millicent Hargrave at the opposite end of the room, looking over the latter's drawings, and aiding her with my critical observations and advice, at her particular desire. But in spite of my efforts to remain composed, my attention wandered from the drawings to the merry group, and against my better judgment, my wrath rose, and doubtless my countenance lowered, for Millicent, observing that I must be tired of her daubs and scratches, begged I would join the company now, and defer the examination of the remainder to another opportunity. But while I was assuring her that I had no wish to join them, and was not tired, Mr. Huntingdon himself came up to the little round table at which we sat.
"Are these yours?"
said he, carelessly taking up one of the drawings. "No, they are Miss Hargrave's."
"Oh. Well, let's have a look at them."
And regardless of Miss Hargrave's protestations that they were not worth looking at, he drew a chair to my side, and receiving the drawings, one by one, from my hand, successively scanned them over, and threw them on the table, but said not a word about them, though he was talking all the time. I don't know what Millicent Hargrave thought of such conduct, but I found his conversation extremely interesting, though, as I afterwards discovered, when I came to analyse it, it was chiefly confined to quizzing the different members of the company present, and albeit he made some clever remarks, and some excessively droll ones, I do not think the whole would appear anything very particular, if written here, without the adventitious aids of look and tone and gesture, and that ineffable but indefinite charm, which cast a halo over all he did and said, and which would have made it a delight to look in his face, and hear the music of his voice, if he had been talking positive nonsense, and which, moreover, made me feel so bitter against my aunt when she put a stop to this enjoyment, by coming composedly forward, under pretence of wishing to see the drawings, that she cared and knew nothing about, and while making believe to examine them, addressing herself to Mr. Huntingdon, with one of her coldest and most repellent aspects, and beginning a series of the most commonplace and formidably formal questions and observations, on purpose to wrest his attention from me, on purpose to vex me, as I thought. And having now looked through the portfolio, I left them to their tete-a-tete, and seated myself on a sofa, quite apart from the company, never thinking how strange such conduct would appear, but merely to indulge, at first, the vexation of the moment, and subsequently to enjoy my private thoughts. But I was not left long alone, for Mr. Wilmot, of all men the least welcome, took advantage of my isolated position to come and plant himself beside me. I had flattered myself that I had so effectually repulsed his advances on all former occasions, that I had nothing more to apprehend from his unfortunate predilection. But it seems I was mistaken. So great was his confidence, either in his wealth or his remaining powers of attraction, and so firm his conviction of feminine weakness, that he thought himself warranted to return to the siege, which he did with renovated ardour, enkindled by the quantity of wine he had drunk, a circumstance that rendered him infinitely the more disgusting. But greatly as I abhorred him at that moment, I did not like to treat him with rudeness, as I was now his guest, and had just been enjoying his hospitality, and I was no hand at a polite but determined rejection, nor would it have greatly availed me if I had, for he was too coarse-minded to take any repulse that was not as plain and positive as his own effrontery. The consequence was, that he waxed more fulsomely tender, and more repulsively warm, and I was driven to the very verge of desperation, and about to say I know not what, when I felt my hand, that hung over the arm of the sofa, suddenly taken by another, and gently but fervently pressed. Instinctively I guessed who it was, and on looking up, was less surprised than delighted to see Mr. Huntingdon smiling upon me. It was like turning from some purgatorial fiend to an angel of light, come to announce that the season of torment was past.
"Helen,"
said he. He frequently called me Helen, and I never resented the freedom.
"I want you to look at this picture. Mr. Wilmot will excuse you a moment, I'm sure."
I rose with alacrity. He drew my arm within his, and led me across the room to a splendid painting of Van Dyck's that I had noticed before, but not sufficiently examined. After a moment of silent contemplation, I was beginning to comment on its beauties and peculiarities, when, playfully pressing the hand he still retained within his arm, he interrupted me with,
Never mind the picture. It was not for that I brought you here. It was to get you away from that scoundrelly old profligate yonder, who was looking as if he would like to challenge me for the affront.
I am very much obliged to you, said I. This is twice you have delivered me from such unpleasant companionship.
Don't be too thankful,
he answered.
It is not all kindness to you. It is partially from a feeling of spite to your tormentors that makes me delighted to do the old fellow a bad turn, though I don't think I have any great reason to dread them as rivals. Have I, Helen?
You know I detest them both.
And me?
I have no reason to detest you.
But what are your sentiments towards me? Helen, speak. How do you regard me?
And again he pressed my hand, but I feared there was more of conscious power than tenderness in his demeanour, and I felt he had no right to extort a confession of attachment from me when he had made no correspondent avowal himself, and knew not what to answer. At last I said, How do you regard me?
Sweet angel, I adore you.
Helen, I want you a moment,
said the distinct low voice of my aunt, close beside us, and I left him, muttering maledictions against his evil angel. Well, aunt, what is it? What do you want? said I, following her to the embrasure of the window.
I want you to join the company when you are fit to be seen,
returned she, severely regarding me.
But please to stay here a little, till that shocking colour is somewhat abated, and your eyes have recovered something of their natural expression. I should be ashamed for anyone to see you in your present state.
Of course, such a remark had no effect in reducing the shocking colour. On the contrary, I felt my face glow with redoubled fires, kindled by a complication of emotions, of which indignant, swelling anger was the chief. I offered no reply, however, but pushed aside the curtain and looked into the night, or rather into the lamp-lit square.
Was Mr. Huntingdon proposing to you, Helen?
Inquired my too watchful relative. No.
What was he saying then? I heard something very like it.
I don't know what he would have said if you hadn't interrupted him.
And would you have accepted him, Helen, if he had proposed?
Of course not, without consulting uncle and you.
Oh, I'm glad, my dear, you have so much prudence left. Well, now,
she added, after a moment's pause,
you have made yourself conspicuous enough for one evening. The ladies are directing inquiring glances towards us at this moment, I see. I shall join them. Do you come too, when you are sufficiently composed to appear as usual.
I am so now.
Speak gently, then, and don't look so malicious,
said my calm but provoking aunt.
We shall return home shortly, and then,
she added with solemn significance,
I have much to say to you.
So I went home prepared for a formidable lecture. Little was said by either party in the carriage during our short transit homewards, but when I had entered my room and thrown myself into an easy-chair, to reflect on the events of the day, my aunt followed me thither, and having dismissed Rachel, who was carefully stowing away my ornaments, closed the door, and placing a chair beside me, or rather at right angles with mine, sat down. With due deference I offered her my more commodious seat. She declined it, and thus opened the conference.
Do you remember, Helen, our conversation the night but one before we left Stanningley?
Yes, aunt.
And do you remember how I warned you against letting your heart be stolen from you by those unworthy of its possession, and fixing your affections where approbation did not go before, and where reason and judgment withheld their sanction?
Yes, but my reason—
Pardon me. And do you remember assuring me that there was no occasion for uneasiness on your account, for you should never be tempted to marry a man who was deficient in sense or principle, however handsome or charming in other respects he might be, for you could not love him, you should hate, despise, pity, anything but love him. Were not those your words?
Yes, but—
And did you not say that your affection must be founded on approbation, and that, unless you could approve and honour and respect, you could not love?
Yes, but I do approve, and honour, and respect.
How so, my dear? Is Mr. Huntingdon a good man?
He is a much better man than you think him.
That is nothing to the purpose. Is he a good man?
Yes, in some respects. He has a good disposition.
Is he a man of principle?
Perhaps not exactly, but it is only for want of thought. If he had someone to advise him, and remind him of what is right.
He would soon learn, you think, and you yourself would willingly undertake to be his teacher? But, my dear, he is, I believe, full 10 years older than you. How is it that you are so beforehand in moral acquirements?
Thanks to you, aunt, I have been well brought up, and had good examples always before me, which he, most likely, has not. And besides, he is of a sanguine temperament, and a gay, thoughtless temper, and I am naturally inclined to reflection.
Well, now you have made him out to be deficient in both sense and principle, by your own confession.
Then my sense and my principle are at his service.
That sounds presumptuous, Helen. Do you think you have enough for both? And do you imagine your merry, thoughtless profligate would allow himself to be guided by a young girl like you?
No, I should not wish to guide him, but I think I might have influence sufficient to save him from some errors, and I should think my life well spent in the effort to preserve so noble a nature from destruction. He always listens attentively now when I speak seriously to him, and I often venture to reprove his random way of talking, and sometimes he says that if he had me always by his side he should never do or say a wicked thing, and that a little daily talk with me would make him quite a saint. It may he partly jest and partly flattery, but still—
But still you think it may be truth?
If I do think there is any mixture of truth in it, it is not from confidence in my own powers, but in his natural goodness. And you have no right to call him a profligate, aunt. He is nothing of the kind.
Who told you so, my dear? What was that story about his intrigue with a married lady? Who was it? Miss Wilmot herself was telling you the other day.
It was false, false, I cried. I don't believe a word of it.
You think, then, that he is a virtuous, well-conducted young man?
I know nothing positive respecting his character. I only know that I have heard nothing definite against it, nothing that could be proved at least. Until people can prove their slanderous accusations, I will not believe them. And I know this, that if he has committed errors, they are only such as are common to youth, and such as nobody thinks anything about. For I see that everybody likes him, and all the mammas smile upon him, and their daughters, and Miss Wilmot herself, are only too glad to attract his attention.
Helen, the world may look upon such offences as venial. A few unprincipled mothers may be anxious to catch a young man of fortune without reference to his character, and thoughtless girls may be glad to win the smiles of so handsome a gentleman, without seeking to penetrate beyond the surface. But you, I trusted, were better informed than to see with their eyes, and judge with their perverted judgment. I did not think you would call these venial errors.
Nor do I, aunt. But if I hate the sins, I love the sinner, and would do much for his salvation, even supposing your suspicions to be mainly true, which I do not and will not believe.
Well, my dear, ask your uncle what sort of company he keeps, and if he is not banded with a set of loose profligate young men whom he calls his friends, his jolly companions, and whose chief delight is to wallow in vice, and vie with each other who can run fastest and furthest down the headlong road to the place prepared for the devil and his angels.
Then I will save him from them.
Oh, Helen, Helen! You little know the misery of uniting your fortunes to such a man.
I have such confidence in him, aunt, notwithstanding all you say, that I would willingly risk my happiness for the chance of securing his. I will leave better men to those who only consider their own advantage. If he has done amiss, I shall consider my life well spent in saving him from the consequences of his early errors, and striving to recall him to the path of virtue. God grant me success." Here the conversation ended, for at this juncture my uncle's voice was heard from his chamber, loudly calling upon my aunt to come to bed. He was in a bad humour that night, for his gout was worse. It had been gradually increasing upon him ever since we came to town, and my aunt took advantage of the circumstance next morning to persuade him to return to the country immediately, without waiting for the close of the season. His physician supported and enforced her arguments, and, contrary to her usual habits, she so hurried the preparations for removal, as much for my sake as my uncle's, I think, that in a very few days we departed, and I saw no more of Mr. Huntingdon. My aunt flatters herself I shall soon forget him. Perhaps she thinks I have forgotten him already, for I never mention his name, and she may continue to think so, till we meet again, if ever that should be. I wonder if it will.
End of chapter 17. Of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
August 25th. I am now quite settled down to my usual routine of steady occupations and quiet amusements, tolerably contented and cheerful, but still looking forward to spring with the hope of returning to town, not for its gaieties and dissipations, but for the chance of meeting Mr. Huntingdon once again, for still he is always in my thoughts and in my dreams. In all my employments, whatever I do, or see, or hear, has an ultimate reference to him. Whatever skill or knowledge I acquire is some day to be turned to his advantage or amusement. Whatever new beauties in nature or art I discover are to be depicted to meet his eye, or stored in my memory to be told him at some future period. This, at least, is the hope that I cherish, the fancy that lights me on my lonely way. It may be only an ignis fatuus after all, but it can do no harm to follow it with my eyes and rejoice in its lustre, as long as it does not lure me from the path I ought to keep. And I think it will not, for I have thought deeply on my aunt's advice, and I see clearly now the folly of throwing myself away on one that is unworthy of all the love I have to give, and incapable of responding to the best and deepest feelings of my inmost heart, so clearly that even if I should see him again, and if he should remember me and love me still, which, alas, is too little probable, considering how he is situated, and by whom surrounded, and if he should ask me to marry him, I am determined not to consent until I know for certain whether my aunt's opinion of him or mine is nearest the truth. For if mine is altogether wrong, it is not he that I love, it is a creature of my own imagination. But I think it is not wrong. No, no, there is a secret something, an inward instinct that assures me I am right. There is essential goodness in him, and what delight to unfold it! If he has wandered, what bliss to recall him! If he is now exposed to the baneful influence of corrupting and wicked companions, what glory to deliver him from them! Oh, if I could but believe that Heaven has designed me for this! To-day is the 1st of September, but my uncle has ordered the gamekeeper to spare the partridges till the gentlemen come. What gentlemen? I asked when I heard it. A small party he had invited to shoot. His friend Mr. Wilmot was one, and my aunt's friend, Mr. Boreham, another. This struck me as terrible news at the moment, but all regret and apprehension vanished like a dream when I heard that Mr. Huntingdon was actually to be a third. My aunt is greatly against his coming, of course. She earnestly endeavoured to dissuade my uncle from asking him, but he, laughing at her objections, told her it was no use talking, for the mischief was already done. He had invited Huntingdon and his friend Lord Loughborough before we left London, and nothing now remained but to fix the day for their coming. So he is safe, and I am sure of seeing him. I cannot express my joy. I find it very difficult to conceal it from my aunt, but I don't wish to trouble her with my feelings till I know whether I ought to indulge them or not. If I find it my absolute duty to suppress them, they shall trouble no one but myself. And if I can really feel myself justified in indulging this attachment, I can dare anything, even the anger and grief of my best friend, for its object. Surely I shall soon know, but they are not coming till about the middle of the month. We are to have 2 lady visitors also. Mr. Wilmot is to bring his niece and her cousin Millicent. I suppose my aunt thinks the latter will benefit me by her society, and the salutary example of her gentle deportment and lowly intractable spirit; and the former, I suspect, she intends as a species of counter-attraction to win Mr. Huntingdon's attention from me. I don't thank her for this, but I shall be glad of Millicent's company. She is a sweet, good girl, and I wish I were like her, more like her, at least, than I am. 19th. They are come. They came the day before yesterday. The gentlemen are all gone out to shoot, and the ladies are with my aunt, at work in the drawing-room. I have retired to the library, for I am very unhappy, and I want to be alone. Books cannot divert me, so having opened my desk, I will try what may be done by detailing the cause of my uneasiness. This paper will serve instead of a confidential friend into whose ear I might pour forth the overflowings of my heart. It will not sympathize with my distresses, but then it will not laugh at them, and if I keep it close, it cannot tell again. So it is, perhaps, the best friend I could have for the purpose. First, let me speak of his arrival. How I sat at my window and watched for nearly 2 hours before his carriage entered the park gates, for they all came before him, and how deeply I was disappointed at every arrival, because it was not his. First came Mr. Wilmot and the ladies. When Millicent had got into her room, I quitted my post a few minutes to look in upon her and have a little private conversation, for she was now my intimate friend, several long epistles having passed between us since our parting. On returning to my window, I beheld another carriage at the door. Was it his? No, it was Mr. Boreham's plain dark chariot, and there stood he upon the steps, carefully superintending the dislodging of his various boxes and packages. What a collection! One would have thought he projected a visit of 6 months at least. A considerable time after, came Lord Loughborough in his barouche. Is he one of the profligate friends, I wonder? I should think not, for no one could call him a jolly companion, I'm sure, and besides, he appears too sober and gentlemanly in his demeanour to merit such suspicions. He is a tall, thin, gloomy-looking man, apparently between 30 and 40, and of a somewhat sickly, careworn aspect. At last Mr. Huntington's light phaeton came bowling merrily up the lawn. I had but a transient glimpse of him, for the moment it stopped, he sprang out over the side on to the portico steps, and disappeared into the house. I now submitted to be dressed for dinner, a duty which Rachel had been urging upon me for the last 20 minutes, and when that important business was completed, I repaired to the drawing-room, where I found Mr. and Miss Wilmot and Millicent Hargrave already assembled. Shortly after, Lord Loughborough entered, and then Mr. Boreham, who seemed quite willing to forget and forgive my former conduct, and to hope that a little conciliation and steady perseverance on his part might yet succeed in bringing me to reason. While I stood at the window, conversing with Millicent, he came up to me, and was beginning to talk in nearly his usual strain, when Mr. Huntingdon entered the room. "How will he greet me, I wonder?" said my bounding heart, and instead of advancing to meet him, I turned to the window to hide or subdue my emotion. But having saluted his host and hostess, and the rest of the company, he came to me, ardently squeezed my hand, and murmured he was glad to see me once again. At that moment dinner was announced. My aunt desired him to take Miss Hargrave into the dining-room, and odious Mr. Wilmot, with unspeakable grimaces, offered his arm to me, and I was condemned to sit between himself and Mr. Boreham. But afterwards, when we were all again assembled in the drawing-room, I was indemnified for so much suffering by a few delightful minutes of conversation with Mr. Huntingdon. In the course of the evening, Miss Wilmot was called upon to sing and play for the amusement of the company, and I to exhibit my drawings, and though he likes music, and she is an accomplished musician, I think I am right in affirming that he paid more attention to my drawings than to her music. So far, so good. But hearing him pronounce, sotto voce, but with peculiar emphasis, concerning one of the pieces,
"This is better than all,"
I looked up, curious to see which it was, and to my horror beheld him complacently gazing at the back of the picture. It was his own face that I had sketched there and forgotten to rub out. To make matters worse, in the agony of the moment, I attempted to snatch it from his hand, but he prevented me, and exclaiming,
"No, by George, I'll keep it,"
placed it against his waistcoat, and buttoned his coat upon it with a delighted chuckle. Then, drawing a candle close to his elbow, he gathered all the drawings to himself, as well what he had seen as the others, and muttering,
"I must look at both sides now,"
he eagerly commenced an examination, which I watched, at first, with tolerable composure, in the confidence that his vanity would not be gratified by any further discoveries; for, though I must plead guilty to having disfigured the backs of several, with abortive attempts to delineate that too fascinating physiognomy, I was sure that, with that one unfortunate exception, I had carefully obliterated all such witnesses of my infatuation. But the pencil frequently leaves an impression upon cardboard that no amount of rubbing can efface. Such it seems was the case with most of these, and, I confess, I trembled when I saw him holding them so close to the candle, and poring so intently over the seeming blanks. But still, I trusted, he would not be able to make out those dim traces to his own satisfaction. I was mistaken, however. Having ended his scrutiny, he quietly remarked,
I perceive the backs of young ladies' drawings, like the postscripts of their letters, are the most important and interesting part of the concern.
Then, leaning back in his chair, he reflected a few minutes in silence, complacently smiling to himself, and while I was concocting some cutting speech wherewith to check his gratification, he rose, and passing over to where Annabella Wilmot sat vehemently coquetting with Lord Loughborough, seated himself on the sofa beside her, and attached himself to her for the rest of the evening. So then, thought I, he despises me, because he knows I love him, and the reflection made me so miserable I knew not what to do. Millicent came and began to admire my drawings, and make remarks upon them, but I could not talk to her, I could talk to no one, and upon the introduction of tea, I took advantage of the open door, and the slight diversion caused by its entrance, to slip out, for I was sure I could not take any, and take refuge in the library. My aunt sent Thomas in quest of me, to ask if I were not coming to tea, but I bade him say I should not take any to-night, and happily she was too much occupied with her guests to make any further inquiries at the time. As most of the company had travelled far that day, they retired early to rest, and having heard them all, as I thought, go upstairs, I ventured out, to get my candlestick from the drawing-room sideboard, but Mr. Huntingdon had lingered behind the rest. He was just at the foot of the stairs when I opened the door, and hearing my step in the hall, though I could hardly hear it myself, he instantly turned back.
Helen, is that you?
Said he.
Why did you run away from us?
Good night, Mr. Huntingdon, said I coldly, not choosing to answer the question, and I turned away to enter the drawing-room.
But you'll shake hands, won't you?
Said he, placing himself in the doorway before me, and he seized my hand and held it, much against my will. Let me go, Mr. Huntingdon, said I want to get a candle.
The candle will keep,
returned he. I made a desperate effort to free my hand from his grasp.
Why are you in such a hurry to leave me, Helen?
He said, with a smile of the most provoking self-sufficiency.
You don't hate me, you know.
Yes, I do, at this moment.
Not you. It is Annabella Wilmot you hate, not me.
I have nothing to do with Annabella Wilmot, said I, burning with indignation.
But I have, you know,
returned he, with peculiar emphasis. That is nothing to me, sir, I retorted.
Is it nothing to you, Helen? Will you swear it? Will you?
No, I won't, Mr. Huntingdon, and I will go, cried I, not knowing whether to laugh, or to cry, or to break out into a tempest of fury.
Go then, you vixen,
he said, but the instant he released my hand, he had the audacity to put his arm round my neck and kiss me. Trembling with anger and agitation, and I don't know what besides, I broke away, and got my candle, and rushed upstairs to my room. He would not have done so, but for that hateful picture, and there he had it still in his possession, an eternal monument to his pride and my humiliation. It was but little sleep I got that night, and in the morning I rose perplexed and troubled with the thoughts of meeting him at breakfast. I knew not how it was to be done. An assumption of dignified, cold indifference would hardly do, after what he knew of my devotion, to his face at least. Yet something must be done to check his presumption. I would not submit to be tyrannized over by those bright laughing eyes, and accordingly I received his cheerful morning salutation as calmly and coldly as my aunt could have wished, and defeated with brief answers his one or two attempts to draw me into conversation, while I comported myself with unusual cheerfulness and complaisance towards every other member of the party, especially Annabella Wilmot, and even her uncle and Mr. Boreham were treated with an extra amount of civility on the occasion, not from any motives of coquetry, but just to show him that my particular coolness and reserve arose from no general ill humour or depression of spirits. He was not, however, to be repelled by such acting as this. He did not talk much to me, but when he did speak, it was with a degree of freedom and openness, and kindliness too, that plainly seemed to intimate he knew his words were music to my ears, and when his looks met mine it was with a smile, presumptuous it might be, but oh, so sweet, so bright, so genial, that I could not possibly retain my anger. Every vestige of displeasure soon melted away beneath it, like morning clouds before the summer sun. Soon after breakfast, all the gentlemen save one, with boyish eagerness, set out on their expedition against the hapless partridges, my uncle and Mr. Wilmot on their shooting ponies, Mr. Huntingdon and Lord Loughborough on their legs, the one exception being Mr. Boreham, who, in consideration of the rain that had fallen during the night, thought it prudent to remain behind a little, and join them in a while when the sun had dried the grass. And he favoured us all with a long and minute disquisition upon the evils and dangers attendant upon damp feet, delivered with the most imperturbable gravity, amid the jeers and laughter of Mr. Huntingdon and my uncle, who, leaving the prudent sportsman to entertain the ladies with his medical discussions, sallied forth with their guns, bending their steps to the stables first, to have a look at the horses and let out the dogs. Not desirous of sharing Mr. Boreham's company for the whole of the morning, I betook myself to the library, and there brought forth my easel and began to paint. The easel and the painting apparatus would serve as an excuse for abandoning the drawing-room, if my aunt should come to complain of the desertion, and besides, I wanted to finish the picture. It was one I had taken great pains with, and I intended it to be my masterpiece, though it was somewhat presumptuous in the design. By the bright azure of the sky, and by the warm and brilliant lights and deep long shadows, I had endeavoured to convey the idea of a sunny morning. I had ventured to give more of the bright verdure of spring or early summer to the grass and foliage than is commonly attempted in painting. The scene represented was an open glade in a wood. A group of dark Scotch firs was introduced in the middle distance, to relieve the prevailing freshness of the rest, but in the foreground was part of the gnarled trunk and of the spreading boughs of a large forest tree, whose foliage was of a brilliant golden green, not golden from autumnal mellowness, but from the sunshine and the very immaturity of the scarce expanded leaves. Upon this bough, that stood out in bold relief against the sombre firs, was seated an amorous pair of turtle-doves, whose soft sad-coloured plumage afforded a contrast of another nature; and beneath it a young girl was kneeling on the daisy-spangled turf, with head thrown back, and masses of fair hair falling on her shoulders, her hands clasped, lips parted, and eyes intently gazing upward in pleased yet earnest contemplation of those feathered lovers, too deeply absorbed in each other to notice her. I had scarcely settled to my work, which, however, wanted but a few touches to the finishing, when the sportsmen passed the window on their return from the stables. It was partly open, and Mr. Huntingdon must have seen me as he went by, for in half a minute he came back, and setting his gun against the wall, threw up the sash and sprang in, and set himself before my picture.
Very pretty, I faith,
said he, after attentively regarding it for a few seconds.
And a very fitting study for a young lady. Spring just opening into summer, morning just approaching noon, girlhood just ripening into womanhood, and hope just verging on fruitation. She's a sweet creature, but why didn't you make her black hair?
I thought light hair would suit her better. You see, I have made her blue-eyed and plump, and fair and rosy.
Upon my word, a very Hebe. I should fall in love with her if I hadn't the artist before me. Sweet innocent. She's thinking there will come a time when she will be wooed and won like that pretty hen-dove by as fond and fervent a lover, and she's thinking how pleasant it will be, and how tender and faithful he will find her.
And perhaps, suggested I, how tender and faithful she shall find him.
Perhaps, for there is no limit to the wild extravagance of Hope's imaginings at such an age.
Do you call that, then, one of her wild extravagant delusions?
No. My heart tells me it is not. I might have thought so once, but now I say, give me the girl I love, and I will swear eternal constancy to her, and her alone, through summer and winter, through youth and age, and life and death, if age and death must come.
He spoke this in such serious earnest that my heart bounded with delight, but the minute after he changed his tone and asked, with a significant smile, if I had
any more portraits?
No, replied I, reddening with confusion and wrath. But my portfolio was on the table. He took it up, and coolly sat down to examine its contents. Mr. Huntingdon, those are my unfinished sketches, cried I, and I never let any one see them. And I placed my hand on the portfolio to wrest it from him, but he maintained his hold, assuring me that he
liked unfinished sketches of all things.
But I hate them to be seen, returned I. I can't let you have it, indeed.
Let me have its bowels, then,
said he, and just as I wrenched the portfolio from his hand, he deftly abstracted the greater part of its contents, and after turning them over a moment, he cried out,
Bless my stars, here's another,
and slipped a small oval of ivory paper into his waistcoat pocket, a complete miniature portrait that I had sketched with such tolerable success as to be induced to colour it with great pains and care, but I was determined he should not keep it. "Mr. Huntingdon," cried I insist upon having that back. It is mine, and you have no right to take it. Give it to me directly. I'll never forgive you if you don't." But the more vehemently I insisted, the more he aggravated my distress by his insulting, gleeful laugh. At length, however, he restored it to me, saying,
"Well, well, since you value it so much, I'll not deprive you of it."
To show him how I valued it, I tore it in two and threw it into the fire. He was not prepared for this. His merriment suddenly ceasing, he stared in mute amazement at the consuming treasure, and then, with a careless
I'll go and shoot now,"
he turned on his heel and vacated the apartment by the window as he came, and setting on his hat with an air, took up his gun and walked away, whistling as he went, and leaving me not too much agitated to finish my picture, for I was glad at the moment that I had vexed him. When I returned to the drawing-room, I found Mr. Boreham had ventured to follow his comrades to the field, and shortly after lunch, to which they did not think of returning, I volunteered to accompany the ladies in a walk, and show Annabella and Millicent the beauties of the country. We took a long ramble, and re-entered the park just as the sportsmen were returning from their expedition. Toil-spent and travel-stained, the main body of them crossed over the grass to avoid us, but Mr. Huntingdon, all spattered and splashed as he was, and stained with the blood of his prey, to the no small offence of my aunt's strict sense of propriety, came out of his way to meet us, with cheerful smiles and words for all but me, and placing himself between Annabella Wilmot and myself, walked up the road and began to relate the various exploits and disasters of the day in a manner that would have convulsed me with laughter if I had been on good terms with him. But he addressed himself entirely to Annabella, and I, of course, left all the laughter and all the badinage to her, and affecting the utmost indifference to whatever passed between them, walked along a few paces apart, and looking every way but theirs, while my aunt and Millicent went before, linked arm in arm, and gravely discoursing together. At length Mr. Huntingdon turned to me, and addressing me in a confidential whisper, said,
"Helen, why did you burn my picture?"
"Because I wished to destroy it," I answered, with an asperity it is useless now to lament.
"Oh, very good,"
was the reply.
"If you don't value me, I must turn to somebody that will."
I thought it was partly in jest, a half-playful mixture of mock resignation and pretended indifference, but immediately he resumed his place beside Miss Wilmot, and from that hour to this, during all that evening, and all the next day, and the next, and the next, and all this morning, the 22nd, he has never given me one kind word, or one pleasant look, never spoken to me but from pure necessity, never glanced towards me but with a cold, unfriendly look I thought him quite incapable of assuming. My aunt observes the change, and though she has not inquired the cause, or made any remark to me on the subject, I see it gives her pleasure. Miss Wilmot observes it too, and triumphantly ascribes it to her own superior charms and blandishments. But I am truly miserable, more so than I like to acknowledge to myself. Pride refuses to aid me. It has brought me into this scrape, and will not help me out of it. He meant no harm. It was only his joyous, playful spirit, and I, by my acrimonious resentment, so serious, so disproportioned to the offence, have so wounded his feelings, so deeply offended him, that I fear he will never forgive me, and all for a mere jest. He thinks I dislike him, and he must continue to think so. I must lose him for ever, and Annabella may win him, and triumph as she will. But it is not my loss, nor her triumph that I deplore so greatly, as the wreck of my fond hopes for his advantage, and her unworthiness of his affection, and the injury he will do himself by trusting his happiness to her. She does not love him. She thinks only of herself. She cannot appreciate the good that is in him. She will neither see it, nor value it, nor cherish it. She will neither deplore his faults, nor attempt their amendment, but rather aggravate them by her own. And I doubt whether she will not deceive him after all. I see she is playing double between him and Lord Loughborough, and while she amuses herself with the lively Huntingdon, she tries her utmost to enslave his moody friend, and should she succeed in bringing both to her feet, the fascinating commoner will have but little chance against the lordly peer. If he observes her artful by-play, it gives him no uneasiness, but rather adds new zest to his diversion, by opposing a stimulating check to his otherwise too easy conquest. Messieurs Wilmot and Boreham have severally taken occasion by his neglect of me to renew their advances, and if I were like Annabella, and some others, I should take advantage of their perseverance to endeavour to pique him into a revival of affection. But, justice and honesty apart, I could not bear to do it. I am annoyed enough by their present persecutions, without encouraging them further, and even if I did it would have precious little effect upon him. He sees me suffering under the condescending attentions and prosaic discourses of the one, and the repulsive obtrusions of the other, without so much as a shadow of commiseration for me, or resentment against my tormentors. He never could have loved me, or he would not have resigned me so willingly, and he would not go on talking to everybody else so cheerfully as he does, laughing and jesting with Lord Loughborough and my uncle, teasing Millicent Hargrave, and flirting with Annabella Wilmot, as if nothing were on his mind. Oh, why can't I hate him? I must be infatuated, or I should scorn to regret him as I do. But I must rally all the powers I have remaining, and try to tear him from my heart. There goes the dinner bell, and here comes my aunt to scold me for sitting here at my desk all day, instead of staying with the company. Wish the company were gone.
End of chapter 18. Of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
22nd. Night. What have I done, and what will be the end of it? I cannot calmly reflect upon it. I cannot sleep. I must have recourse to my diary again. I will commit it to paper to-night, and see what I shall think of it to-morrow. I went down to dinner, resolving to be cheerful and well conducted, and kept my resolution very creditably, considering how my head ached, and how internally wretched I felt. I don't know what has come over me of late. My very energies, both mental and physical, must be strangely impaired, or I should not have acted so weakly in many respects as I have done. But I have not been well this last day or two. I suppose it is with sleeping and eating so little, and thinking so much, and being so continually out of humour. But to return. I was exerting myself to sing and play for the amusement, and at the request of, my aunt and Millicent, before the gentlemen came into the drawing-room. Miss Wilmot never likes to waste her musical efforts on ladies' ears alone. Millicent had asked for a little Scotch song, and I was just in the middle of it when they entered. The first thing Mr. Huntingdon did was to walk up to Annabella.
"Now, Miss Wilmot, won't you give us some music to-night?"
said he.
"Do now. I know you will when I tell you that I've been hungering and thirsting all day for the sound of your voice. Come, the piano's vacant."
It was, for I had quitted it immediately upon hearing his petition. Had I been endowed with a proper degree of self-possession, I should have turned to the lady myself, and cheerfully joined my entreaties to his, whereby I should have disappointed his expectations, if the affront had been purposely given, or made him sensible of the wrong, if it had only arisen from thoughtlessness. But I felt it too deeply to do anything but rise from the music-stool, and throw myself back on the sofa, suppressing with difficulty the audible expression of the bitterness I felt within. I knew Annabella's musical talents were superior to mine, but that was no reason why I should be treated as a perfect nonentity. The time and the manner of his asking her appeared like a gratuitous insult to me, and I could have wept with pure vexation. Meantime, she exultingly seated herself at the piano, and favoured him with two of his favourite songs, in such superior style that even I soon lost my anger in admiration, and listened with a sort of gloomy pleasure to the skilful modulations of her full-toned and powerful voice, so judiciously aided by her rounded and spirited touch; and while my ears drank in the sound, my eyes rested on the face of her principal auditor, and derived an equal or superior delight from the contemplation of his speaking countenance, as he stood beside her. That eye and brow lighted up with keen enthusiasm, and that sweet smile passing and appearing like gleams of sunshine on an April day. No wonder he should hunger and thirst to hear her sing. I now forgave him from my heart his reckless slight of me, and I felt ashamed at my pettish resentment of such a trifle, ashamed too of those bitter, envious pangs that gnawed my inmost heart, in spite of all this admiration and delight.
"There now,"
said she, playfully running her fingers over the keys when she had concluded the second song.
"What shall I give you next?"
But in saying this, she looked back at Lord Loughborough, who was standing a little behind, leaning against the back of a chair, an attentive listener, too, experiencing, to judge by his countenance, much the same feelings of mingled pleasure and sadness as I did. But the look she gave him plainly said,
Do you choose for me now? I have done enough for him, and will gladly exert myself to gratify you.
And thus encouraged, his lordship came forward, and turning over the music, presently set before her a little song that I had noticed before, and read more than once, with an interest arising from the circumstance of my connecting it in my mind with the reigning tyrant of my thoughts. And now, with my nerves already excited, and half unstrung, I could not hear those words so sweetly warbled forth without some symptoms of emotion I was not able to suppress. Tears rose unbidden to my eyes, and I buried my face in the sofa pillow, that they might flow unseen while I listened. The air was simple, sweet, and sad. It is still running in my head, and so are the words.
Farewell to thee, but not farewell to all my fondest thoughts of thee. Within my heart they still shall dwell, and they shall cheer and comfort me. O beautiful and full of grace, if thou hadst never met mine eye, I had not dreamed a living face could fancied charms so far outvie. If I may ne'er behold again that form and face so dear to me, nor hear thy voice, still would I fain preserve for aye their memory. That voice, the magic of whose tone can wake an echo in my breast, creating feelings that, alone, can make my tranced spirit blest. That laughing eye, whose sunny beam my memory would not cherish less, and oh, that smile, whose joyous gleam no mortal language can express. Adieu, but let me cherish still the hope with which I cannot part. Contempt may wound and coldness chill, but still it lingers in my heart. And who can tell but heaven at last may answer all my thousand prayers, and bid the future pay the past, with joy for anguish, smiles for tears.
When it ceased, I longed for nothing so much as to be out of the room. The sofa was not far from the door, but I did not dare to raise my head, for I knew Mr. Huntingdon was standing near me, and I knew by the sound of his voice, as he spoke in answer to some remark of Lord Loughborough's, that his face was turned towards me. Perhaps a half-suppressed sob had caught his ear, and caused him to look round. Heaven forbid! But with a violent effort I checked all further signs of weakness, dried my tears, and when I thought he had turned away again, rose, and instantly left the apartment, taking refuge in my favourite resort, the library. There was no light there but the faint red glow of the neglected fire, but I did not want a light. I only wanted to indulge my thoughts, unnoticed and undisturbed, and sitting down on a low stool before the easy-chair, I sunk my head upon its cushioned seat, and thought, until the tears gushed out again, and I wept like any child. Presently, however, the door was gently opened, and someone entered the room. I trusted it was only a servant, and did not stir. The door was closed again, but I was not alone. A hand gently touched my shoulder, and a voice said softly,
Helen, what is the matter?
I could not answer at the moment.
You must, and shall tell me,
was added, more vehemently, and the speaker threw himself on his knees beside me on the rug, and forcibly possessed himself of my hand. But I hastily caught it away, and replied, It is nothing to you, Mr. Huntingdon.
Are you sure it is nothing to me?
He returned.
Can you swear that you were not thinking of me while you wept?
This was unendurable. I made an effort to rise, but he was kneeling on my dress.
Tell me,
continued he.
I want to know. Because if you were, I have something to say to you, and if not, I'll go.
Go, then, I cried. But fearing he would obey too well, and never come again, I hastily added, Or say what you have to say, and have done with it.
But which?
Said he.
For I shall only say it if you really were thinking of me. So tell me, Helen.
You're excessively impertinent, Mr. Huntingdon.
Not at all. Too pertinent, you mean. So you won't tell me. Well, I'll spare you the woman's pride, and construing your silence into yes. I'll take it for granted that I was the subject of your thoughts, and the cause of your affliction.
Indeed, sir.
If you deny it, I won't tell you my secret,
threatened he, and I did not interrupt him again, or even attempt to repulse him. Though he had taken my hand once more, and half embraced me with his other arm, I was scarcely conscious of it at the time.
It is this,
resumed he.
that Annabella Wilmot, in comparison with you, is like a flaunting peony, compared with a sweet, wild rosebud gemmed with dew, and I love you to distraction. Now tell me if that intelligence gives you any pleasure. Silence again? That means yes. Then let me add that I cannot live without you. And if you answer no to this last question, you will drive me mad. Will you bestow yourself upon me? You will!"
he cried, nearly squeezing me to death in his arms. "No, no!" I exclaimed, struggling to free myself from him. "You must ask my uncle and aunt."
"They won't refuse me if you don't."
"I'm not so sure of that. My aunt dislikes you."
"But you don't, Helen. Say you love me, and I'll go."
"I wish you would go," I replied.
"I will, this instant, if you'll only say you love me."
"You know I do," I answered, and again he caught me in his arms and smothered me with kisses. At that moment my aunt opened wide the door, and stood before us, candle in hand, in shocked and horrified amazement, gazing alternately at Mr. Huntingdon and me, for we had both started up, and now stood wide enough asunder. But his confusion was only for a moment. Rallying in an instant, with the most enviable assurance, he began.
"I beg 10,000 pardons, Miss Maxwell. Don't be too severe upon me. I've been asking your sweet niece to take me for better, for worse, and she, like a good girl, informs me she cannot think of it without her uncle and aunt's consent. So let me implore you not to condemn me to eternal wretchedness. If you favour my cause, I am safe, for Mr. Maxwell, I am certain, can refuse you nothing."
"We will talk of this tomorrow, sir,"
said my aunt coldly.
"It is a subject that demands mature and serious deliberation. At present you had better return to the drawing-room."
"But meantime,"
pleaded he,
"let me commend my cause to your most indulgent—"
"No indulgence for you, Mr. Huntingdon, must come between me and the consideration of my niece's happiness."
"Ah, true. I know she is an angel, and I am a presumptuous dog to dream of possessing such a treasure. But nevertheless, I would sooner die than relinquish her in favour of the best man that ever went to heaven. And as for her happiness, I would sacrifice my body and soul."
"Body and soul, Mr. Huntingdon? Sacrifice your soul?"
"Well, I would lay down life."
"You would not be required to lay it down."
"I would spend it then. Devote my life and all its powers to the promotion and preservation—"
"Another time, sir, we will talk of this, and I should have felt disposed to judge more favourably of your pretensions, if you too had chosen another time and place, and let me add, another manner for your declaration."
"Why, you see, Mrs. Maxwell,"
he began.
"Pardon me, sir,"
said she, with dignity.
"The company are inquiring for you in the other room."
And she turned to me.
"Then you must plead for me, Helen,"
said he, and at length withdrew.
"You had better retire to your room, Helen,"
said my aunt gravely.
"I will discuss this matter with you, too, tomorrow."
"Don't be angry, aunt," said I.
"My dear, I am not angry,"
she replied.
"I am surprised. If it is true that you told him you could not accept his offer without our consent—"
"It is true," interrupted I.
"Then how could you permit—"
"I couldn't help it, aunt," I cried, bursting into tears. They were not altogether the tears of sorrow, or of fear for her displeasure, but rather the outbreak of the general tumultuous excitement of my feelings. But my good aunt was touched at my agitation. In a softer tone she repeated her recommendation to retire, and gently kissing my forehead, bade me good night, and put her candle in my hand, and I went. But my brain worked so, I could not think of sleeping. I feel calmer now that I have written all this, and I will go to bed, and try to win tired nature's sweet restorer.
End of chapter 19. Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
September 24th. In the morning I rose, light and cheerful, nay, intensely happy. The hovering cloud cast over me by my aunt's views, and by the fear of not obtaining her consent, was lost in the bright effulgence of my own hopes, and the too delightful consciousness of requited love. It was a splendid morning, and I went out to enjoy it, in a quiet ramble, in company with my own blissful thoughts. The dew was on the grass, and 10,000 gossamers were waving in the breeze. The happy redbreast was pouring out its little soul in song, and my heart overflowed with silent hymns of gratitude and praise to heaven. But I had not wandered far before my solitude was interrupted by the only person that could have disturbed my musings at that moment without being looked upon as an unwelcome intruder. Mr. Huntingdon came suddenly upon me. So unexpected was the apparition that I might have thought it the creation of an over-excited imagination, had the sense of sight alone borne witness to his presence, but immediately I felt his strong arm round my waist and his warm kiss on my cheek, while his keen and gleeful salutation,
"My own Helen,"
was ringing in my ear. "Not yours yet," said I, hastily swerving aside from this too presumptuous greeting. "Remember my guardians. You will not easily obtain my aunt's consent. Don't you see she is prejudiced against you?"
"I do, dearest, and you must tell me why, that I may best know how to combat her objections. I suppose she thinks I am a prodigal,"
pursued he, observing that I was unwilling to reply,
"and concludes that I shall have but little worldly goods wherewith to endow my better half. If so, you must tell her that my property is mostly entailed, and I cannot get rid of it. There may be a few mortgages on the rest, a few trifling debts and encumbrances here and there, but nothing to speak of, and though I acknowledge I am not so rich as I might be, or have been, still I think we could manage pretty comfortably on what's left. My father, you know, was something of a miser, and in his latter days especially saw no pleasure in life but to amass riches, and so it is no wonder that his son should make it his chief delight to spend them, which was accordingly the case until my acquaintance with you, dear Helen, taught me other views and noble aims, and the very idea of having you to care for under my roof would force me to moderate my expense, and live like a Christian, not to speak of all the prudence and virtue you would instill in my mind, by your wise counsel and sweet, attractive goodness."
"But it is not that," said I. "It is not money my aunt thinks about. She knows better than to value worldly wealth above its price."
"What is it, then?"
"She wishes me to marry none but a really good man."
"What, a man of decided piety? Ahem. Well, come, I'll manage that too. It's Sunday today, isn't it? I'll go to church morning, afternoon, and evening, and comport myself in such a godly sort that she shall regard me with admiration and sisterly love, as a brand plucked from the burning. I'll come home sighing like a furnace, and full of the savoury and unction of dear Mr. Blatton's discourse."
"Mr. Leighton," said I dryly.
"Is Mr. Leighton a sweet preacher, Helen? A dear, delightful, heavenly-minded man?"
"He is a good man, Mr. Huntingdon. I wish I could say half as much for you."
"Oh, I forget you are a saint too. I crave your pardon, dearest, but don't call me Mr. Huntingdon. My name is Arthur."
"I'll call you nothing, for I'll have nothing at all to do with you if you talk in that way any more. If you really mean to deceive my aunt as you say, you are very wicked, and if not, you are very wrong to jest on such a subject."
"I stand corrected,"
said he, concluding his laugh with a sorrowful sigh.
"Now,"
resumed he, after a momentary pause,
let us talk about something else, and come near to me, Helen, and take my arm, and then I'll let you alone. I can't be quiet while I see you walking there."
I complied, but said we must soon return to the house.
"No one will be down to breakfast yet for long enough,"
he answered.
"You spoke of your guardians just now, Helen, but is not your father still living?"
"Yes, but I always look upon my uncle and aunt as my guardians, for they are so indeed, though not in name. My father has entirely given me up to their care. I have never seen him since dear mamma died, when I was a very little girl, and my aunt, at her request, offered to take charge of me, and took me away to Stanningley, where I have remained ever since. And I don't think he would object to anything for me that she thought proper to sanction."
"But would he sanction anything to which she thought proper to object?"
"No, I don't think he cares enough about me."
"He's very much to blame, but he doesn't know what an angel he has for a daughter, which is all the better for me, as if he did he would not be willing to part with such a treasure."
"And Mr. Huntingdon," said I suppose you know I'm not an heiress." He protested he had never given it a thought, and begged I would not disturb his present enjoyment by the mention of such uninteresting subjects. I was glad of this proof of disinterested affection, for Annabella Wilmot is the probable heiress to all her uncle's wealth, in addition to her late father's property, which she has already in possession. I now insisted upon retracing our steps to the house, but we walked slowly, and went on talking as we proceeded. I need not repeat all we said. Let me rather refer to what passed between my aunt and me, after breakfast, when Mr. Huntingdon called my uncle aside, no doubt to make his proposals, and she beckoned me into another room, where she once more commenced a solemn remonstrance, which, however, entirely failed to convince me that her view of the case was preferable to my own. "You judge him uncharitably, aunt, I know," said I. "His very friends are not half so bad as you represent them. There is Walter Hargrave, Millicent's brother, for one. He is but a little lower than the angels, if half she says of him is true. She is continually talking to me about him, and lauding his many virtues to the skies."
"You will form a very inadequate estimate of a man's character,"
replied she,
"if you judge by what a fond sister says of him. The worst of them generally know how to hide their misdeeds from their sisters' eyes, and their mothers too."
"And there is Lord Loughborough," continued I, "quite a decent man."
"Who told you so? Lord Loughborough is a desperate man. He has dissipated his fortune in gambling and other things, and is now seeking an heiress to retrieve it. I told Miss Wilmot so, but you're all alike. She haughtily answered she was very much obliged to me, but she believed she knew when a man was seeking her for her fortune, and when for herself. She flattered herself she had had experience enough in those matters to be justified in trusting to her own judgment. And as for his lordship's lack of fortune, she cared nothing about that, as she hoped her own would suffice for both. And as for his wildness, she supposed he was no worse than others. Besides, he was reformed now. Yes, they can all play the hypocrite when they want to take in a fond, misguided woman."
"Well, I think he's about as good as she is," said I. "But when Mr. Huntingdon is married, he won't have many opportunities of consorting with his bachelor friends, and the worse they are, the more I long to deliver him from them."
"To be sure, my dear, and the worse he is, I suppose, the more you long to deliver him from himself."
"Yes, provided he is not incorrigible. That is, the more I long to deliver him from his faults, to give him an opportunity of shaking off the adventitious evil got from contact with others worse than himself, and shining out in the unclouded light of his own genuine goodness, to do my utmost to help his better self against his worse, and make him what he would have been if he had not, from the beginning, had a bad, selfish, miserly father, who, to gratify his own sordid passions, restricted him in the most innocent enjoyments of childhood and youth, and so disgusted him with every kind of restraint, and a foolish mother, who indulged him to the top of his bent, deceiving her husband for him, and doing her utmost to encourage those germs of folly and vice it was her duty to suppress. And then such a set of companions as you represent his friends to be."
"Poor man,"
said she sarcastically.
"his kind have greatly wronged him."
"They have," cried I, "and they shall wrong him no more. His wife shall undo what his mother did."
"Well,"
said she, after a short pause,
"I must say, Helen, I thought better of your judgment than this. And your taste too. How you can love such a man I cannot tell, or what pleasure you can find in his company, for what fellowship hath light with darkness, or he that believeth with an infidel?"
"He is not an infidel, and I am not light, and he is not darkness. His worst and only vice is thoughtlessness."
"And thoughtlessness,"
pursued my aunt,
"may lead to every crime, and will but poorly excuse our errors in the sight of God. Mr. Huntingdon, I suppose, is not without the common faculties of man. He is not so light-headed as to be irresponsible. His Maker has endowed him with reason and conscience as well as the rest of us. The Scriptures are open to him as well as to others. And if he hear not them, neither will he hear through one rose from the dead. And remember, Helen,"
continued she, solemnly,
"the wicked shall be turned into hell, and they that forget God. And suppose even that he should continue to love you, and you him, and that you should pass through life together with tolerable comfort, how will it be in the end when you see yourselves parted forever, you perhaps taken into eternal bliss, and he cast into the lake that burneth with unquenchable fire, there for ever to—"
"Not for ever," I exclaimed, "only till he has paid the uttermost farthing. For, if any man's work abide not the fire, he shall suffer loss, yet himself shall be saved, but so as by fire. And he that is able to subdue all things to himself will have all men to be saved, and will in the fullness of time gather together in one all things in Christ Jesus, who tasted death for every man, and in whom God will reconcile all things to himself, whether they be things in earth or things in heaven."
"Oh, Helen, where did you learn all this?"
"In the Bible, aunt. I have searched it through, and found nearly 30 passages, all tending to support the same theory."
"And is that the use you make of your Bible? And did you find no passages tending to prove the danger and the falsity of such a belief?"
"No. I found indeed some passages that, taken by themselves, might seem to contradict that opinion, but they will all bear a different construction to that which is commonly given, and in most the only difficulty is in the word which we translate everlasting or eternal. I don't know the Greek, but I believe it strictly means for ages, and might signify either endless or long enduring. And as for the danger of the belief, I would not publish it abroad if I thought any poor wretch would be likely to presume upon it to his own destruction. But it is a glorious thought to cherish in one's own heart, and I would not part with it for all the world can give." Here our conference ended, for it was now high time to prepare for church. Every one attended the morning service, except my uncle, who hardly ever goes, and Mr. Wilmot, who stayed at home with him to enjoy a quiet game of cribbage. In the afternoon Miss Wilmot and Lord Loughborough likewise excused themselves from attending, but Mr. Huntingdon vouchsafed to accompany us again. Whether it was to ingratiate himself with my aunt, I cannot tell, but if so, he certainly should have behaved better. I must confess I did not like his conduct during service at all. Holding his prayer book upside down, or open at any place but the right, he did nothing but stare about him, unless he happened to catch my aunt's eye, or mine, and then he would drop his own on his book, with a puritanical air of mock solemnity that would have been ludicrous if it had not been too provoking. Once, during the sermon, after attentively regarding Mr. Layton for a few minutes, he suddenly produced his gold pencil case and snatched up a Bible. Perceiving that I observed the movement, he whispered that he was going to make a note of the sermon, but instead of that, as I sat next to him, I could not help seeing that he was making a caricature of the preacher, giving to the respectable, pious, elderly gentleman the air and aspect of a most absurd old hypocrite. And yet, upon his return, he talked to my aunt about the sermon with a degree of modest, serious discrimination that tempted me to believe he had really attended to and profited by the discourse. Just before dinner my uncle called me into the library for the discussion of a very important matter, which was dismissed in few words.
"Now, Nell,"
said he,
"this young Huntingdon has been asking for you. What must I say about it? Your aunt would answer no, but what say you?"
"I say yes, uncle," replied I, without a moment's hesitation, for I had thoroughly made up my mind on the subject.
"Very good,"
cried he.
"Now that's a good, honest answer. Wonderful for a girl. Well, I'll write to your father tomorrow. He's sure to give his consent, so you may look on the matter as settled. You'd have done a deal better if you'd taken Wilmot, I can tell you, but that you won't believe. At your time of life it's love that rules the roost. At mine it's solid, serviceable gold. I suppose now you'd never dream of looking into the state of your husband's finances, or troubling your head about settlements, or anything of that sort?"
"I don't think I should."
"Well, be thankful then that you've wiser heads to think for you. I haven't had time yet to examine thoroughly into this young rascal's affairs, but I see that a great part of his father's fine property has been squandered away. But still I think there's a pretty fair share of it left, and a little careful nursing may make a handsome thing of it yet. And then we must persuade your father to give you a decent fortune, as he only has one besides yourself to care for. And if you behave well, who knows but what I might be induced to remember you in my will,"
continued he, putting his fingers to his nose with a knowing wink. "Thanks, uncle, for that, and all your kindness, replied I.
Well, and I questioned this young spark on the matter of settlements,
continued he,
and he seemed disposed to be generous enough on that point.
I knew he would, said I, but pray don't trouble your head, or his, or mine, about that. For all I have will be his, and all he has will be mine. And what more could either of us require? And I was about to make my exit, but he called me back.
Stop! Stop!
cried he.
We haven't mentioned the time yet. When must it be? Your aunt would put it off till Lord knows when, but he is anxious to be bound as soon as may be. He won't hear of waiting beyond next month, and you, I imagine, will be of the same mind, so—
Not at all, uncle. On the contrary, I should like to wait till after Christmas at least.
Oh, pooh, pooh, never tell me that tale. I know better,
cried he, and he persisted in his incredulity. Nevertheless, it is quite true. I am in no hurry at all. How can I be, when I think of the momentous change that awaits me, and of all I have to leave? It is happiness enough to know that we are to be united, and that he really loves me, and I may love him as devotedly, and think of him as often as I please. However, I insisted upon consulting my aunt about the time of the wedding, for I determined her counsels should not be utterly disregarded, and no conclusions on that particular are come to yet.
End of chapter 20.